Greetings and welcome. Today we're looking at the organizational, the corporate, and the regulatory failures which contributed to the Macondo disaster in 2010 in the Gulf of Mexico. This material is based on the U.S. Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board, which conducted its work completing in 2016, in other words, 6 years after the accident. We have to, first of all, notice or observe that the technologies and the engineering problems which were faced by deep water drilling in the Gulf were very large challenges. The drilling was taking place at great depth, and the materials, the gas and petroleum reserves which were being tapped were under very high pressure and high temperature. However, the Macondo disaster was most strongly influenced, it would appear from this report, by the organizational, corporate, and regulatory failures which occurred rather than an uncertain technology. In particular, poor communication and specification of responsibilities between BP and Transocean bear a very large part of the responsibility. Second, there was a lack of implementation of rigorous process safety procedures on the part of both BP and also Transocean. And there was a deliberate minimal compliance strategy, which was followed by the drilling contractor, Transocean. All of this comes out of the report from the U.S. Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board report. This disaster, therefore, reflected several different kinds of organizational dysfunctions. We can notice that there were multiple loosely connected contractors with poor communication, poor coordination among them. Second, we can notice that there was a corporate failure, especially in BP, to adequately implement process safety requirements on its highly risky activities in drilling and extracting natural gas and petroleum from deep water wells. It does appear that cost and production pressure took priority over process safety. And third, there was clearly what appears to be regulatory failure. The mineral management, whatever the MMS, was virtually absent in its regulatory role concerning deep water drilling and production during this episode. The way that the U.S. Chemical Safety Board report frames these issues is in terms of risk management. And their view is, and it's a very stark conclusion, I'm speaking from volume 3 of this voluminous report, quoting from the report, neither company, BP or Transocean, sufficiently managed major hazard risks at the Macondo well. Continuing the quote, at Macondo, BP and Transocean did not clarify hazard identification and risk management roles and responsibilities for safety critical activities contained within the temporary abandonment program. So that's a failure of communication and specification of responsibilities between the two companies. Consequently, while both companies had more rigorous corporate policies for risk management, neither assumed effective responsibility for ensuring that their implementation at Macondo was complete. This chapter of the report addresses the corporate policies that establish the basis for BP and Transocean's risk management expectations. A new term, at least new for us in the course, is introduced in this report, which is ALARP. And what that refers to is the preparation of safety and risk standards at a level as rigorous as reasonably practicable. A level as reasonably practicable. But I think we have to notice that as specified in these words, this definition does not provide an actionable standard. We don't know what reasonable means. Is it, for example, a consideration of cost per marginal unit of safety improvement? What really is involved in the idea of reasonable in this context? And it certainly does not explicitly incorporate the issue of the severity and likelihood of harm of the risky activity. But here's another more illuminating description of the ALARP principle, quoting, ALARP is also defined as efforts to reduce risk that are continued until the incremental sacrifice in terms of cost, time, effort, or other expenditure of resources is grossly disproportionate to the incremental risk reduction achieved. That definition is very specific, grossly disproportionate to the incremental risk reduction achieved. We've seen before in talking about risk and safety and process safety with Andrew Hopkins' examples, the idea of a HAZOPS analysis, or the idea of a full analysis of a complex activity which undertakes to identify all of the possible failure modes, the hazards which could arise, and then a consideration of how either to prevent those hazards or to accommodate them when they occur. Quoting from the report, IADC recommends that a drilling contractor identify in writing hazardous operations and barriers that likely fall under its responsibility, including running drill pipe into and out of a well, well testing, and displacing a well. So this is a specification that there should be a HAZOPS analysis of these risky activities in the process of drilling and then closing a well. But it's worth reflecting on the role that industry associations play in contributing to the regulatory environment. IADC is the International Association of Drilling Contractors, which is an industry association. And so it's worth us asking the question whether an industry association may have a biased set of interests concerning safety. On the other hand, the quotations which are provided in the report from IADC reflect a substantial level of expertise in organizational and process safety. I found this diagram to be an interesting one because it's an analysis of, it's a tool, a graphic tool that has been developed to identify the barriers to catastrophic outcomes for risky events. And it's called a bow tie for the obvious reason. But these are mitigation controls on the right and prevention controls on the left. And the idea is to specify in detail what processes, what machinery, what alarm procedures, and so forth have been put in place to either prevent the catastrophic event, the accident, or to ameliorate the consequences if it occurs. But the findings of the report are quite severe, especially with regard to Transocean's behavior. Quoting from the report, Transocean offered minimal internal guidance and unclear expectations of the risk management tools its personnel should use for an offshore operation or facility, and the more rigorous ones that the corporation had established were not applied at the Macondo well. That's a very damning statement because it kind of implies that Transocean doesn't imply, it states, it asserts that Transocean gave little guidance to operational procedures to maintain a safe environment in this risky process. Continuing this line of thought, for the Macondo well, scant evidence exists that Transocean used any of these risk management tools to adequately assess hazards and implement effective controls to manage loss of well control risks. So Transocean comes across as having kind of a cowboy approach to safety rather than a careful process-driven approach involving a careful analysis of risk and hazard. Quoting again, Transocean stated that ALARP, quote, requires personnel to consider the various risk reduction measures and determine if the effort and cost of these measures justify the additional amount of risk reduction obtained. But I draw your attention to the fact that this statement is severely, orders of magnitude, less restrictive than the definition that we quoted above, which specifies grossly disproportionate. If we just followed Transocean's stipulation here, then a simple cost-benefit analysis might be followed, whereas the recommended standard is that there should be a gross disproportion between the cost of an intervention and the harm which it is intended to ameliorate. And in fact, Transocean, there is kind of a smoking gun that's provided in the report, because Transocean explicitly states that it is pursuing a minimum or minimal compliance strategy. Quoting, the Transocean internal investigation, the DWH investigation team, identified that regulatory requirements to undertake more in-depth analysis of major hazard events influenced the level of analysis actually conducted by the company. The comments from the Transocean investigation team portray the use of MHRA as a minimum compliance approach. Transocean will use the more effective approach only if the regulatory regime requires it. This minimal compliance approach undermines Transocean's claim of reducing major accident risk to ALARP, because if the same company recommends and uses a more effective risk management approach for the same activity elsewhere, then the less rigorous approach clearly is not ALARP. So what about BP? After the Texas City disaster, which we've talked about in previous sessions, BP undertook to adopt the recommendations of the Baker Report, which was undertaken after the BP Texas City disaster. And they agreed to, and now I'll quote, agreed to adopt the Baker Report recommendations establishing a board reporting process to track progress to implementation of improved safety procedures. BP also responded to findings and recommendations from the CSB, the same entity which is authoring this report, and the Baker panel by developing an overhaul of its corporate safety management system approach to its entire global operations. So this is a very substantial step which BP agreed to following the Texas City disaster, and OMS was its response. OMS was intended to be a company-wide process safety set of requirements to be implemented at all sites. But it turns out that the implementation of this OMS set of procedures and rules began in 2007, but it was a very slow process. In 2009, 2 years later, it was only 80% complete, and it was not applied to the Macondo operations in 2010. And by contract with Transocean, the terms of OMS should have passed through to Transocean. However, this was also not implemented. In other words, the more rigorous safety standards which BP had adopted and committed itself to following Texas City were not implemented for the Macondo site because the implementation process had not gotten to basically to that part of the company's operations. And furthermore, the company failed to stipulate that Transocean must adopt the same level of safety standard. This discussion documents, demonstrates the importance of coordination and bridging documents between operator and contractor. If BP has one set of expectations about process safety and Transocean has another set, that is a possible source of serious accident and future hazard. And in this instance, there's good evidence that there was exactly that failure of coordination, failure of explicit bridging documents requiring Transocean to comply with BP's own process safety requirements. Quoting, if BP had worked with Transocean to develop an MAR, Major Accident Report Study, It could have examined a Transocean 2009 report that expressed riser unloading events as, quote, the biggest concern. This was exactly what occurred at Macondo when identifying areas for improvement. Transocean experienced 6 such events in the previous year. Transocean's report recommended preventing the riser unloading events by, quote, treating every positive indicator as a kick and shutting in the well quickly. So there was a recommendation for what to do when a weak signal is received. Transocean received that recommendation but failed to implement it. Continuing the quotation, BP and Transocean could have used that analysis to improve well control planning, training, and response practices and continually reduce the risk of a Macondo type event. Again, a very damning conclusion on the part of the safety board. But here is a really tough question. It's an important question for us in this course because our interest is a public policy interest. How can safety regulations, which are kind of well understood, the safety regulations, the process safety approach, which BP had formalized, was in fact a rigorous and detail-oriented approach to process safety, but it did not implement that approach consistently across all of its operations. So here's the hard question. How in the United States can BP, Transocean, or any company operating in the areas subject to BSEE jurisdiction, offshore in other words, be required to implement effective risk management practices? Volume 4 of this report addresses this question, but the basic answer is to enact regulatory requirements for more robust risk management approaches, including demonstrated risk reduction to ALARP and explicit safety accountability by all parties creating the risk. Explicit safety accountability by all parties creating the risk, which would have meant that Transocean and BP jointly had financial and legal liability for the risks or the damages created by the disaster. So let's turn now a little more briefly to the question of corporate governance, the question of what the governing boards of a corporation, what role the governing board should play in ensuring process safety. And there is an assumption that a board has purely fiduciary responsibility to ensure that the resources and assets of a company are properly handled. But in fact, there's a very strong case to be made for the idea that a governing board should take more responsibility than that for ensuring implementation of process safety requirements. But here's a quote again from the report. Despite efforts to manage process safety and major accident risk, the two companies' boards adopted governance approaches that emphasized personal safety and commercial risk without assuring process safety and major accident prevention. Again, a very damning statement. Personal safety and commercial risk were of concern to the boards, but not process safety and major accident prevention. Returning to the quote, in part, these approaches are illustrated through a study of shareholder communications, required U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission reporting, and other public information released by both companies. But here's the view that's taken by an important observer of corporate governance, William Allen, who's the chancellor or was the chancellor of the Delaware Court of Chancery, who argues for a much more active and responsible role for corporate boards in the conduct of the company's compliance with adequate safety procedures. Quoting from Allen, this hands-off view of the responsibilities of membership on the board of directors of a public company is, in my opinion, badly deficient. It ignores a most basic responsibility, the duty to monitor the performance of senior management in an informed way. Outside directors should function as active monitors of corporate management, not just in crisis, but continually. They should have an active role in the formulation of the long-term strategic, financial, and organizational goals of the corporation and should approve plans to achieve those goals. They should as well engage in the periodic review of short and long-term performance according to plan and be prepared to press for appropriate action when there is need. This is a very strong statement about what the responsibilities of the corporate governance system ought to take on. And even more briefly, a document that I decided in the end not to ask you to read, but it's available to you as a resource. This is the question of regulation, and we'll have more discussion of regulation in upcoming sessions. But the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe document, which is called Risk Management in Regulatory Frameworks, is a kind of an interesting, relevant, informative document. Here's the definition which they offer of a regulatory system. We define a regulatory system for any given sector as a set of processes that include setting regulatory requirements and voluntary standards for the production of goods and the provision of services, drafting laws and regulations, and putting controls in place to check that products meet requirements and specifications. This is a simple, logical definition of what a regulatory regime is. And what's involved in establishing a regulatory regime? Here are the steps which this report identifies. And again, it's pretty logical and pretty straightforward, but I think it's worth laying it out. First, setting objectives of the regulatory system. Second, management of assets. Third, risk identification in the process. If it's the food industry, then the risk of contamination of various kinds. If it's the nuclear power industry, the risk of a meltdown or other kinds of nuclear accidents. Third, risk analysis and evaluation, understanding what are the most important and dangerous risks. 5, choosing risk treatment strategies, what to do about the possibility of food contamination or the possibility of a loss of coolant accident in a nuclear power reactor. Implementing risk treatment strategies, contingency planning and crisis management. And this is the part that has to do with what to do once a disaster has occurred. And finally, monitoring, reviewing, and improving the risk management process. These are just kind of logical steps that are necessary in order to establish a regulatory system. They also try to specify what is needed in order to have a regulatory process. There needs to be a clearly defined set of objectives for the regulatory system. If the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, for example, there needs to be a solid basis in law for this system of regulation. There needs to be a set of available national and international standards. In the regulations, there needs to be reference to these standards in legislation and in the regulations associated with the regulatory regime. And finally, the regulatory regime ought to relate to international best practice. And this last point is important because of the idea of regulatory convergence. Especially for products, it's desirable that European standards should be compatible with US standards, which in turn ought to be compatible with other major producer standards. So creating a regulatory policy is one thing, but establishing an effective regime of enforcement and compliance is another. The regulations may exist on paper, but how do we implement those regulations and how do we ensure compliance? Here's what the report has to say about implementation. It's necessary to secure cooperation and communication among various stakeholders, and they note that the stakeholders have different interests. Second, it's important to have the necessary infrastructure in order to allow assessment and also to engage in what they call market surveillance. Food safety is the best way of illustrating market surveillance. Inspecting food production facilities is one way of enhancing food safety, but also doing spot inspections of grocery stores. That would be market surveillance. And then finally, in order to implement, there needs to be planning, budgeting, and other aspects of systematic project management in order to get a regulatory system going adequately. If the NRC is tasked to ensure to a high degree of confidence the safety of nuclear reactors, but then its budgeting is at $10 million a year, whereas a reasonable estimate of cost would be $150 million a year. Clearly, that regulatory system is not going to be successful. So let's turn now to the most difficult part of a regulatory system, which is enforcement and compliance. Again, quoting from the European document, from the perspective of a regulator, the most fundamental choice in this domain is the choice among different conformity assessment regimes, or what we might call compliance options, including first-party conformity assessment based on a producer's own internal testing system and resulting in the supplier's declaration of conformity, and, on the other hand, third-party conformity assessment. And that would be external audits or inspections. And a second related comment, market surveillance, which is basically looking out there at the products and the outcomes. Market surveillance can be defined as the set of activities carried out and measures taken by designated authorities to ensure that products comply with the requirements set out in relevant legislation and do not endanger health, safety, or any other aspect of public interest protection. But truthfully, this document, I find anyway, not very convincing on the topic of compliance. It's not very detailed on the topic of compliance. The idea of first-party assessment, which is a very common recourse for a regulatory regime, but first-party assessment clearly involves potential conflicts of interest and incentives to hide or misrepresent the realities. And we saw that in the Transocean case. Third-party assessment can be more neutral and fact-based, but it is often resisted by operators and executives, including hiding, misrepresenting, or evading the facts of the case. So this United Nations ECE document does not give attention to the predictable dysfunctions in regulatory regimes, including under-resourced agencies, industry capture of the regulatory agency, and the fact of a pervasive pro-business worldview that is suspicious of regulation.